Hello, and welcome to another edition of Sharp Takes. Today is the major session of the legislature is over, and I am delighted to have return for another visit Senator Scott Beck, who was a minority leader of the Republicans in the Senate, on the conference committee to resolve the issues between the House and the Senate on the education transformation bill and shepherd that through the legislative process. So, welcome. It's
Thanks for
great to
having
have
me.
you back, Scott.
Thanks for having me. This
Yeah.
is great.
Um, and why don't you start by giving us a little review of what's actually in this bill?
Okay. And let me just even go what's in the bill, the process, which was terribly interesting, like none I've ever seen before in the legislature. But when House Bill 454 started out, it started in the House, and when it left the House, it didn't even have 76 votes to pass. It had 70, and they were struggling to get that. And so a decision was made to move the bill along so that the bill wouldn't die and that it could keep going. So what left the House wasn't even a bill that had majority support. And then it came over to the Senate, and the Senate made some changes. It went through a three-committee process, and it got to as it was about ready to go to the floor, it had majority support, but it had far more Republicans supporting it than Democrats. And so the decision was made to pull the bill back and to move to more of what was the House version, and bring that to the floor. That bill did also did not have majority support, and so the decision was made to put the votes together to actually move it out of the Senate, and then the House asked for a conference. So that's very strange. Usually, when a bill leaves a body, it has majority support, but this bill was just so contentious that there was no majority support. And so, when we got to the conference committee, you had a version of the House bill and the Senate bill, neither of which really had majority support of their bodies, and that made for a very awkward and unusual conference.
Yeah, I
Um,
imagine.
but anyhow, so what's in the bill? There, I say, are three major components to the bill. One is it moves Vermont to a foundation formula. Right now, we're in a system where districts ask for whatever amount of money that their voters will approve, and then the sum of all those requests is what the legislature has to pay. And those requests have been growing for several years now in the 6 to 8% a year. And that's very difficult to come up with the revenue to pay those bills. And that's what I think a lot of what we saw last fall with the property tax revolt in the election. What we're what H 454 moves to is a foundation system. And in a foundation, the state will give each district a defined amount of money, um, and the district will take that money. They don't even have to have a district vote to receive that money. And then the district will have the option of spending a little bit more, up to 10% to begin with, and then 5%. And for that, they will need a vote of their voters, and um, they will get an additional tax rate to pay for that additional money. So that's one big piece of the bill. The other, the second piece of the bill, I'd say, is it establishes a task force to look at Vermont and to figure out how we can more efficiently govern the entire system more efficiently than 119 school districts and 52 SUs, and a handful of like maybe a dozen SD school supervisory districts deliver education. And I don't know, the governor's plan was five. There's a whole bunch of ideas about how that would go probably between five and 20 districts. That task force will meet this summer and fall and will recommend to the legislature a plan in January. What's important for your your viewing audience to understand is that if the legislature doesn't implement district regovernance, change the districts, then the funding formula doesn't go into effect. So they both have to happen. And that's really important for everybody to understand. And then I think the third thing that is probably the biggest change in the bill, and it is that right now, Vermont has, we have a homestead grand list, which is all the properties that people live in, that they own. And then we have a non-homestead grand list, which is everything else, apartments, businesses, second homes, everything else. And in this bill, there is a move, although it requires a few more steps, that would divide up that non-homestead grand list into second homes and then everything else. And that impact in that change is very different based on different communities. Because in it, for example, in a ski community that has a whole bunch of second homes, it might be a big factor. Other areas it won't. But that's a big step to take. And then maybe I'd add a fourth. And the fourth is that the on the issue of independent schools and public tuition, effective July 1st of this year, the number of eligible schools that can receive those public monies will shrink, from, I think it's about 46 to 19. And those schools will have to be located in areas of the state where there really are no public schools to serve those kids. So an over about a 60% contraction there, and public tuition will no longer be allowed to travel out of state. Um, all public schools that receive public tuition will continue to be able to receive public tuition just like they do today. Yeah. So I'd say those are probably the four big pieces of the bill.
All right, there's a lot there.
There's
to
a lot, and there's a
unpack.
whole bunch of little pieces too.
Yeah. So let's start with the finance,
Yeah.
partly because that's maybe your strongest area of
Yeah.
expertise, and also we used to have a foundation formula, and it failed a Supreme Court test,
Yes.
which led to Act 60 and 68, and that was largely because, if I can paraphrase, largely because towns that were wealthier and had a stronger belief in education were willing to spend and able to spend a lot more than low income communities that
Yeah.
didn't necessarily have such a high value on education. And that disparity led to the Supreme Court decision. Why is this foundation formula different? Why will it not fail again?
Well, the foundation formula, that we used before X60 was, I'd say, different in two significant ways. One is that the foundation was funded at that time at 7%. So the state funded the foundation at 7%. The remainder, which is almost nearly all of it, the town was on the district was on its own grand list. Under this construct in H454, the foundation is funded at 100%. And any spending above the foundation, that 5 or 10% that a district could spend more, the rate that they receive is equalized across the state. So the same rate for the same money, type of thing. And so it's a very different foundation formula. And you touched on something there, which I didn't mention in any of my comments, is that, which I think is kind of important for everybody to understand, is that this change, H454, for all intents and purposes, it eliminates Act 60. It ends Act 60, which has, kind of been a lightning rod in this state for quite well since it was passed some 27 years ago.
It's been criticized.
Yeah.
However, it's outlived all the other
It has.
state funding systems.
It has.
In my understanding,
Yeah.
I mean, it's lasted since 67, 97.
97. Yeah.
97 to 2007, 27 before it's gone, right?
Right.
Because
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
projecting the fact that there are changes in districts. That won't happen until fiscal year 28, right? So it'll be
Fiscal year 29.
29.
29, yeah. That was
So,
the earliest we thought we could redistrict would
yeah.
be 29. Yeah.
So 30 years, Act
Right.
60
Yeah.
survived despite
Yeah.
complaints.
Lots of
Um,
complaints. Yeah.
um,
I think what's one thing is kind of interesting, and you touched on it, was that you touched on the disparity between under the foundation formula, the previous foundation formula, towns that had wealth and were willing to spend it, and towns that didn't have it and
right.
couldn't spend it. That there was this big disparity between these high spending and low spending towns. What's really interesting though is that Act 60, which was one of the intents, was to equalize that. Um, it didn't do a very good job. In fact, right now in Vermont, the difference between our highest spending districts and our lowest spending districts is about double. About the highest spenders spend about twice as much as the low spenders, and that disparity just right there is actually, I think it's still the worst in the country. So from that standpoint, Act 60 didn't really work. It might have improved the situation, but it didn't really go far enough. Under this new foundation formula construct, everybody will get 100%, regardless of whether they're currently a low spending town or a high spending town. And the only disparity will be that extra 5 or 10% that a district may choose to spend.
So interesting that you use the term 100%. So that may be the legislature's viewpoint of what 100% should be. My understanding is that Addison County, as a county, would lose millions. And
Yes.
so there'd be a lot less money available to educate students in districts that are right now struggling to provide quality
Yeah.
education.
Maybe. Um, we do know, and you are correct, that the foundation amount that Addison County would receive would be less than what they're currently spending. However, they will receive a much lower tax rate than they currently have right now, and they will have that, at least to start, 10% that they can bring it up. Where that all sugars off, can that 10% make up the loss? I don't know. I haven't done
Yeah.
the numbers on that, but I think that's when we've heard a lot of this districts like, I'm going to get less. No, the foundation you receive will be less than what you spend right now, but you do have the opportunity to spend more.
On
Uh,
your own grand list.
no, it would be equalized across the state, but
Oh,
you would, if you spent, another $1 million, um, your tax rate would be the same as another district that spent $1 million, assuming they have the same number of
yeah.
kids. It's
That's
equalized.
similar to what's happening with the tax rates now.
Yes, yeah, our
Yeah,
tax rates right now are equalized across the
yeah.
districts. Um, the foundation tax rate is equalized. Everybody will receive the same tax rate
Hmm.
for that money. For the districts that decide to spend more, that additional will be equalized across the state. So same rate for the same money.
What if a district decides to spend 15% more?
They are not allowed to under 454. There's a ceiling there.
So that's interesting that somehow towns are prohibited from doing this, or school
Yeah.
districts. Um, don't don't people that have money and want to spend money always find a way to do it?
Well,
Whether it's the town owning the skating rink, or maybe the new gym is built and the town is a recreation facility is built on a local grand list, and they rent that facility to the school district for $1.
yeah, I suppose there are some workarounds that they could do along those lines. As you know, there is a pretty in statute, it says what are education expenses and what are municipal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose there could be potential workarounds there. I mean, my own, not what ended up in the bill, is you don't
Yeah, you
always
don't
get
get
everything you want.
you rarely get
my
everything you
my
want.
perspective was on the additional spending was like, why do I care? Like, as long as that rate is equalized, um, you know, and I can say that the foundation will give every town enough money to offer an excellent education. Why do I care?
Yeah.
That sentiment did not prevail. 10% to start with prevailed, going down to 5%.
Yeah.
The people, I think equity is important. I think equality is
Yeah.
important,
Yeah.
but um, I was willing to let that equality conversation go at 100%. Others continued that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah,
It is always a challenge working a bill through the
yeah.
process. Um, and like the Rolling Stone song says, you don't always get
Get
what
what
you
you want.
want, but if you try, sometimes you
uh,
get what you
the
need.
legislature, you almost never get what you want.
Um, so I wonder, one of the things that I wonder about funding, to just stay on that for
Yeah.
a little bit longer, is there are costs that the school districts are incurring that are well above inflation. The foundation amount is only indexed to, and I'd be curious to which inflation figure it's.
NIPA.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And healthcare in particular
right.
sticks out, both mental and
Yeah,
physical healthcare.
yeah.
Insurance rates are going through the roof. And what is, if anything, is in this bill or is the legislature proposing to do about those runaway costs?
I think there's two pieces to that puzzle. One is just the cost of healthcare in Vermont, and then the other is what is the cost of the healthcare, the health insurance policy that teachers receive. That's what's called VHI, which is administered through Blue Cross Blue Shield. And we did do two things this year, I think, to try to take a shot at those that the increasing cost of healthcare. One was which I think is probably your viewing audience knows that for the most part, our community hospitals in Vermont are, I wouldn't necessarily say they're in crisis, but they're struggling.
Yeah.
Some are a little bit ahead, some are a little bit behind, which is concerning. You'd like them all to have enough net income to plan for the future and invest. But there's been one huge winner in this whole thing,
Yeah.
UVM Medical Center. Their profits dwarf all the rest of them combined. And so there was a move this year to basically put a cap on them and to, in fact, they extracted $25 million from UVM Medical Center with some strict controls on what could happen going forth. Vermont has the highest health insurance rates in the country. It is arguable that UVM Medical Center is the most expensive hospital in the world.
Yeah.
So that was done. The other thing that was done, and it was kind of late in the session, was there's two things. I'd say there's two things that are really driving up healthcare in Vermont. One is our age demographics. We're just getting older, and as you get older, you require more medicines, more visits, more procedures, more everything. But the other thing that has happened is that there have been a number of new procedures, new medicines that have become very popular, and they're very expensive. And this has really happened over the last 2 or 3 years. And some of those um, medications, for example, hospitals were charging as much as 700% or 1,000% more than above what these medicines cost. And so there was a bill we passed, and I don't remember the bill number, but um, it it's capped those margins to 120%.
Yeah.
That alone will save $47 million to the system. So that's on the cost of health insurance side. On the other side is the VHI, the negotiation that occurs between the teachers union and the school district boards. And what basically what has happened is there's been a lot of subsequent decisions, not all by the legislature, some by rule, and that negotiation has become very, very favorable for the employees. And we're effectively at the point right now where after somebody that's on VHI um, pays their premiums, pay their premiums, deducted out of their paycheck every couple weeks, and after that, healthcare is basically free. And as you can imagine, if something's free, it gets utilized quite a lot. And um, the premium just becomes very expensive. School districts have to pay for 80% of that premium, and that number has skyrocketed. So I think there is I think the next renegotiation to inject the legislature into that conversation is in 2026, and I think you will see a move to change that negotiation so that um, VHI and the plans that educators receive is more in line with what most Vermonters would expect. I don't think most Vermonters would think that I pay my premium and then all healthcare is free, right? Most people there's copays, there's deductibles, this is all masked by an HRA right now, and so I think that what you will see is a change to the negotiation so that um, we're not paying 100, we're not paying for um, everything after the premium. Those, I mean, just a gold CDHP family plan, which is not the richest VHI plan out there, it costs $44,000 right now.
Wow.
That's of course on top of salary. So it increases the costs of the districts really really quickly, and so we're trying to get a handle on that negotiation next year.
All right. So let's shift. We can't. We could spend the whole time talking
We could,
finance,
we could.
and so I want to talk a little bit, ask you some questions about new districts. So
Yeah.
there's this committee that the legislature has set up. That's not the Commission on Public Education. It's not an existing committee. This is a new study committee that the
Yep.
legislature has set up to figure out and bring three plans to the legislature. Is that right?
As many as three. Yeah.
As many as three,
Yeah.
and between 4,000 and 8,000 students. It's student count we're talking,
Right.
right?
And
And
with an as practical, but yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and one of the things that puzzles me about that is the PICUS report that you saw when we were doing Act 46 recommends, it says the most efficient school districts are pupils of, if I remember correctly, 3,900 pupils. So let's say 4,000
Yeah.
pupils. So it's curious to me that the legislature set that as a floor rather than an ideal.
Yeah, I think some of that is that the research has probably changed in the last 10 years. And there are other opinions of, for example, we had a gentleman, I can't remember his last name, Neil. He testified in front of our committee many years
Yeah.
ago. He's in um, does a lot of redistricting. He's been a superintendent all over the country. He's worked in Vermont extensively. He was in our committee, and we asked him, said, like, what's the number? Like, what do you think is the correct number? And he 10 to 15,000. Yeah, so there are differences of opinion on
Wow.
what is the right number.
Yeah.
Right now, the bill says 4 to 8,000, but we were able to put language in there. The Senate proposed language that would, as practical. So
Okay.
if you're talking about Chittenden County, maybe 4 to 8,000 makes all the sense in the world.
It's different. It's close to Vermont, but it's a little
Yeah,
different.
yeah. I mean, so I think you're going to see a lot of. I think you'll see a lot of softening
Yeah.
on that, and I think that will be very important for rural areas.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that's really interesting about how do you cobble this together is I think there's a real important layer of to make sure that every district or SU has a CTE center. That would be and so when you're talking like, well, you got Chittenden County with 24,000 students and two CTE centers.
Yeah.
So how do you get between 4 to 8?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You might have to attach CVU and I don't know Mount Mansfield to Essex, Westford, because they have a tech center. Just as an example, that would be well over 8,000
Yeah.
kids. So there are some complicating factors, and I think that I think everybody wants to do what makes sense. But what makes sense in Chittenden County might not make sense in Addison County. It might not make sense in my corner
Yeah.
of the state. So I think we got the language in there. I think that allows the task force to have some leeway to
Yeah.
maybe, with these numbers.
I'm really glad you touched on CTE. My opinion is that until we until it is seamless,
Yeah.
like in St. Johnsbury, I think, the
Yeah.
school you teach in,
Yeah.
until it's seamless for students to
Yeah.
go from their so-called academic or traditional high school
Yeah.
to a CTE center, we will not address the needs that we have for
Right.
tradespeople
Yeah.
in our state.
No, it has to be easy for kids to get there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that I hope that that's a part of the work for
Yeah.
this commission to
Yeah.
create school districts, that somehow we create districts where it become and a financing system where it becomes seamless to move
Yeah.
from traditional academic schools to technical centers.
Yeah. I think that's very important. It has to be easy. It can't be cost prohibitive. It has to be seamless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And right now we know we have this tension between any high school student in Addison County, Middlebury, Virginia, or Bristol who decides to go to the tech center in Middlebury,
Right.
that comes out of their budget.
It does. Yeah.
And
That's the problem.
and so there's a tension here
Yeah.
about wanting to keep students, or who do you let go to the
Right.
tech center
Right.
when state law says every student has a right to technical education.
Yeah. That district that has that child, there's a big disincentive for them to let that kid go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Which is not what we want.
I want to touch on, we only have a few minutes left. I want to touch on what is reported to be the biggest contention in the conference committee, and that was around independent schools and how much they would get. And it was a little surprising to me that the independent schools were permitted to get, I think the number was 5% more above the foundation formula, just as a matter of practice. That puzzled me.
Well, it's limited to the 9 through 12 population. And the reason it kind of works similar to the what they call supplemental spending, which is the district's ability to spend 5 or 10% more. So it's kind of there's a parallel there. But really, the reason why it's in there is that, as you know, for I think it even predates Act 60, Vermont has assigned a weight to secondary students, acknowledging that specialized instruction costs a little bit more than elementary. Um, we were at 0.125 for decades. We're at 0.39 right now, which I think is too high. In January, Professor Colby, in a study, recommended 0.25. And then magically, 2 days before the bill left the House, this study showed up out of nowhere that said 0, and they put that in the bill. There's a lot of mistrust right now that 0 is correct. Statewide data from AOE indicates that the number is in fact 0.125. And so this is no big deal for a pre-K through 12 district. Grade weights mean nothing because the superintendent can just move the money to where they need to move it in the district for whatever the needs of the district are. But for districts that either send students or receive students, it's a big deal because there's no way to move the money between the sending district and the receiving school, whether it's public or independent, unless there's a weight in there. And so the secondary weight and CTE, for that matter, they are in the base. Like, the money is there for secondary and CTE, and it will go to the district. I'll use my district as an example. So all the money for secondary students and all the money for CTE students will go to the district. And that money should follow that secondary student or follow that CTE student to the receiving school, whether it's a public school or an independent school. But without a weight, there's no mechanism for that money to move. And so that's why that weight is so important. If we don't do that, then our secondary and CTE funds are stuck in the elementary school and they don't go to pay for secondary or CTUs.
So this 5% applies to, like, Mount Abe is going to send kids to the CTE. That 5% applies there too,
No,
or
public CTEs have a carve out. Public CTEs are going to continue to be able to charge tuition just like they do now. So there's no change there. Um, but the independent school CTEs, um, they weren't going to be able to do that. So they were going to be prohibited from charging tuition. The public CTEs were going to be continued to allow public tuition, and that's where in the end we put in the bill was that these two independent CTEs, St. Johnsbury Academy and Linden Institute, just those two schools, they will be able to continue to set their tuition just like a public
yeah.
CTE does.
Sounds like that still needs work.
It does. I mean, the really simple solution is just put in a secondary weight and put in a CTE weight, and then we don't have to worry about any of this stuff.
Yeah.
But the House refused to put in that secondary and CTE weight, so we're left with a situation where secondary monies are going to go to districts, but they can't follow the students to the school that they go to, and the same for CTE. It was a simple fix, but we could not get them to put it in there. So we're going to have some mechanisms down the road to hopefully get it done.
Yeah, there's always more work to do in
There
education,
is.
isn't there?
There is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to thank you so much for coming in and
Yeah. Thanks
helping
for
the
having me.
public understand this bill and where education's headed.
Yeah.
This isn't, some things are going to take place next year, right?
Yeah. And I think that's a big thing for your viewing audience is that this is just, if we think of this as a chessboard, the first pawn's out.
Yeah.
I mean, there are so many more things that
Yeah.
have to happen and decisions that have to be made between now and when this thing would all roll out in FY29. And even then, in FY29, there's a 5-year transition
Yeah.
into this. So we're probably looking at it at least 6 to 8 more years of work to
Yeah.
fully
But
get this
next
thing in.
year, class sizes go into effect, right?
July 1 of 2026.
Yeah.
Yep, that's the first thing I'm going to try to get out of there. I can't. I think that is a terrible. I think it's a terrible idea.
Yeah.
I think there's just too much nuance. Um, it's I just really. I think that was one of the things in the bill that I liked the least.
Yeah.
I really didn't think that
I
was a
think
good idea.
doesn't it really affect small community elementary schools big time?
It does, and it discourages so much. Like it discourages specialized courses that kids need, language, um, STEM. I mean,
Yeah.
there's all these like courses where it's just like it's really hard um, to get large numbers of kids. I mean, there are some carve outs in there and different
Yeah.
things, but I just think that if we think our school districts and superintendents are uh, smart people that should be making the best decisions they can for kids. I don't think strangling them with classroom size requirements is the way to
We should
get
actually
the
let
best
them do their job. They're the
Exactly,
experts, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
And I just look at it. There's so much gamesmanship that could occur to, I mean, and they will because they're looking out for the kids,
Yeah.
which is what they should be doing. Yeah, it was one of the pieces of the bill that I had the least love for.
Well, appreciate your work in the legislature. Miss you in the House.
Yeah.
But you got a much bigger role to play, and the governor's ear. And I commend you for the work you've managed
you.
to accomplish.
Thank you.
So thanks a lot, and thanks for listening to us today and this episode of Sharp Takes.
Want to be a guest on Sharp Takes? Have an opinion you want Dave to hear about? Email davesharp@gmavt.net.